Okay, ready to dive into something super important.
I'm all ears.
Let's talk boundaries.
Love it. So key for a happier, healthier life, right?
Absolutely. And, we're not talking about like building walls and shutting everyone out.
Right. It's more about figuring out what works for you, what you're okay with, what you're not okay with.
Exactly. Like having those healthy limits in all sorts of relationships.
And it's interesting, a lot of the stuff I was reading really emphasized that this isn't about like trying to control other people.
It's more about taking charge of your own well-being.
Yes, exactly. Which is kind of empowering when you think about it that way.
Totally. It reminds me of this one article I read. It was talking about boundaries being like fences, not walls.
Ooh, I like that.
Yeah. So you're defining your own space, but you're not trying to like control everything and everyone around you.
That's such a good analogy. And it really gets across that idea that healthy relationships actually need those boundaries to really thrive.
For sure. It prevents all those misunderstandings and resentment that can build up over time.
Ugh, tell me about it. Resentment is the worst.
The worst. Okay, but how do we actually set these boundaries?
That's the million-dollar question, right?
Especially when it can be so awkward or feel like, well, kind of bad.
Oh, 100%. Saying no is hard.
So hard.
Yeah.
What are some strategies to make it easier?
Well, all the research I looked at, almost everything emphasized self-awareness as the first step.
Okay, that makes sense. Know yourself first.
Right. Before you even start thinking about where to draw those lines, you got to figure out where you stand. Like, what are your values? What helps you feel safe and respected?
It's true. It's like that saying, you can't pour from an empty cup.
Yeah.
Got to fill yourself up
Yeah,
first.
100%.
So then how do we figure out, like, what our boundaries even are?
So one article had this super practical exercise, and I loved it. Imagine your life is a house.
Okay.
And each room in that house is like a different area of your life. Work, relationships, personal time, all that.
Mm.
So think about who's allowed in each room and what are they allowed to do there? Are there any rooms that are totally off limits to certain people?
Ooh, I like that.
Right. Or maybe they can come in, but they can't touch anything.
It's like setting ground rules for different parts of your life.
Yes.
Exactly.
You got it.
Okay, so once you've got a handle on those boundaries, what's the next step? How do you communicate them to people?
Communication is key. And it's got to be clear and respectful. That's where I statements are your best friend.
I statements.
Yeah.
Those are always so helpful.
The best. Because it's not about blaming or attacking the other person. It's about sharing how their actions are making you feel.
Right. So instead of saying, you're always interrupting me, it's more like, I feel frustrated when I'm interrupted because it makes it hard to gather my thoughts.
Perfect example. You're owning your feelings and experiences. And the research shows that this is way more likely to lead to, actual conversations that go somewhere.
Makes total sense. Now, I'm curious, there are different types of boundaries too, right? It's not just about saying no to plans or whatever.
You're spot on. There are actually 7 key types.
7. Okay, we got to break those down.
Let's do it. And understanding these can really change the game in how you deal with, like, all kinds of relationships. So first up, physical boundaries.
Okay, so that's about, like, personal space.
Yeah. How close someone stands to you, how comfortable you are with touch, even, like, your stuff.
Right. Some people need a lot of personal space. Others are good with being closer.
Totally. And then you've got emotional boundaries. Those are all about protecting your feelings, your mental energy, all of that.
Okay, so with that one, do you ever feel pressured to, like, overshare personal things?
Mm-hmm. All the time.
Or maybe you feel like you're always getting sucked into other people's emotional dramas.
Exactly. That's a sign you might need some stronger emotional boundaries.
That's like those emotional vampires we've all encountered.
Yes. Energy zappers.
They can really drain you.
Yeah.
But you're saying, once you're aware of that, there are ways to protect yourself.
Definitely. Like limiting contact with those people, setting time limits on conversations, even just being mindful of what topics you talk about with them.
Okay, so we've got physical, we've got emotional.
Mm-hmm.
What comes next?
How about time? Because seriously, who has enough time these days?
I haven't run out of time.
Right. So time boundaries are about taking control of your schedule, making sure you have enough time for, yourself, the things that matter most. And let's be real, your sanity.
Oh my gosh, yes. So that could be saying no to taking on another project at work, or setting aside time for yourself, even if it means saying no to social events.
Exactly. It's about realizing that your time and energy are valuable, and you get to choose how you use them.
Absolutely.
And another boundary that I think often gets overlooked is the intellectual one.
Oh, that's an interesting one. What does that look like?
It's about feeling safe and respected when it comes to your thoughts, your ideas, your opinions. Like feeling comfortable disagreeing with someone without being afraid of being shut down.
Oh, that makes so much sense. So, for example, someone is constantly dismissing your ideas or talking over you. Setting those intellectual boundaries might mean you speak up more, or you choose to opt out of conversations that are going nowhere.
You got it. And this kind of goes hand in hand with another important boundary, the spiritual one.
Okay, spiritual boundaries. What are those about?
Honoring your beliefs and your values, even if they're different from those around you.
So that might look like opting out of certain conversations or respectfully declining to engage in debates that you know will just be uncomfortable.
Exactly. It's about staying true to yourself and what you believe in.
Definitely. Okay, I'm ready for the next one.
Okay, let's talk about a topic that can be a bit tricky. Financial boundaries.
Oh yeah, money. Always a fun conversation starter.
Huh. Right. But seriously, it's so important. Financial boundaries are all about being independent and making sure you're not in situations where you feel resentful or taken advantage of.
So that come up a lot in, like, relationships?
Oh, for sure. It could be things like setting clear agreements about shared expenses with a roommate or a partner. Or maybe it's about not lending money to family members if it's going to put you in a tough spot.
Right, putting yourself first in that situation.
Yes. And feeling comfortable saying no to those requests for money, even if it's coming from someone you love. Your financial well-being matters.
It really does. Okay, what's the last type of boundary on our list?
This one's really interesting, cultural boundaries.
Oh, I'm intrigued. Tell me more.
It's all about navigating those generational and cultural differences, all those different values and expectations we all have.
Oh, absolutely. Like, if you come from a culture where direct communication is valued, but your partner's from a culture that's more indirect, that could lead to some serious misunderstandings.
Totally. Or maybe there are differences in how you view parenting choices, family stuff, all of that. It's about finding a balance that respects both your own cultural background and the norms of the people around you.
It sounds like that one takes a lot of communication and understanding.
It really does. But if you go into those conversations with empathy and wanting to learn about each other, it can actually make your bond stronger.
That's a great point. Okay, so we've covered the 7 types of boundaries. Wow, that's a lot to think about.
I know, right? It's like a whole new way of thinking about how we interact with the world.
It totally is. But before we go too far down that road, let's rewind a bit. How do we actually start implementing these boundaries? Like, where do we even begin?
That's the question, right?
Because I think a lot of people listening right now are probably like, okay, this all sounds great in theory, but what do I do?
The good news is you don't have to change your whole life overnight. Start small. Pick one area where you want to set a boundary and focus on that.
Okay, so maybe you're feeling totally drained by all the social events you have coming up. You could start by saying no to just one event, or setting a time limit for how long you'll stay.
Exactly. Baby steps. And remember those I statements. They're your superpower.
Right. Like, I'd love to, but...
Yes. It's not about being aggressive. It's about advocating for what you need and being respectful while you do it.
Okay, so start small. Practice those I statements. Anything else?
This is important. Setting boundaries is not a one-time fix. It's an ongoing thing.
Makes sense. Life is always changing.
It is. So your relationships change. Your needs change. And your boundaries might have to change too.
You're right. That's actually really reassuring to hear. I think we put so much pressure on ourselves to get it right the first time.
Ugh, yes. And then if things change, which they always do, we feel like we failed or something.
Totally. But it's more like boundaries are fluid. They evolve with us.
Yes. And the more we can embrace that, the less pressure it is on us, right?
100%. It gives us more freedom to design a life we love, one that actually works.
Exactly. And speaking of freedom, there's another big piece of this we have to talk about.
Oh, I'm intrigued. What's that?
Self-esteem. It plays a huge role in all of this. I'd say it's kind of the foundation for healthy boundaries.
Oh, that makes sense. Because if you don't believe you deserve respect, it's going to be way harder to actually set those boundaries and stick to them.
Exactly. When you value yourself and believe that your needs matter, it's so much easier to speak up for yourself.
It's true. It's like that saying, we accept the love we think we deserve.
Oh, I love that one.
If we don't think we're worthy of respect, then we'll put up with a lot of things we shouldn't.
So true. That's why self-compassion is so important. Treat yourself with the same kindness you'd offer a good friend.
That's such good advice.
Yeah.
But it's hard sometimes.
It is hard. but if we're always criticizing ourselves, it just makes it that much harder to set healthy boundaries with other people.
You're right, almost like we have to set boundaries with ourselves first, around negative self-talk, around people-pleasing, around not prioritizing our well-being.
Yes. It all starts with us. When we learn to show up for ourselves with love and compassion,
Then we can show up for others in a way that feels more authentic.
yes, and more empowering.
I love that. Okay, so we've covered the different types of boundaries, how to start implementing them, and the role of self-esteem. What else is there? This is great.
Well, I think it's time to address the elephant in the room. Guilt.
Guilt.
Yep. One of the articles I read said that many of us struggle with boundaries because we're terrified of letting people down or, making them angry.
The fear of being called selfish. It's so real.
Yeah.
I've definitely talked myself out of setting a boundary because I didn't want to rock the boat.
Oh, me too. But here's the thing. Feeling guilty is often a huge sign that a boundary is actually needed.
Right, really?
Think about it. If you're constantly feeling taken advantage of or resentful, it's usually because you haven't communicated your limits.
That's a good point. Like hoping the other person will magically read your mind and change their behavior.
Exactly. But the research shows people who are comfortable setting boundaries, they actually have better relationships.
Because everything's out in the open.
Right. You're clear about what you need, which allows the other person to be their true selves too.
And if they can't respect that,
Well, then that's on them, not you.
that's a good point. Okay, so let's say you're in a situation where you need to set a boundary, but you're worried about how the other person's going to react. What then?
One of the articles had this great acronym, Dear Man. Have you heard of this?
Dear man.
No.
Okay, I'm listening. Tell me everything.
All right, so D stands for describe the situation. Instead of going straight into accusations, just state the facts. Be objective.
So, like, instead of saying you're always late, it's more like, I noticed that you arrived 20 minutes after the time we agreed to meet.
Exactly, just the facts. Then E is for express your feelings. Time for those I statements again.
Right. I feel frustrated when this happens.
Perfect. You're owning your experience, not blaming. A is for assert your needs. This is where you state clearly what you need going forward.
So maybe it's, in the future, I need you to be on time, or if something comes up, please let me know as soon as possible so I can adjust my plans.
Nailed it. You're setting a clear expectation. Okay, R is a reminder to reinforce.
Reinforce.
What does that mean? It's about letting the other person know what's in it for them if they respect your boundary. Not manipulating, but highlighting the good things that happen when they change their behavior.
Okay, so for example, you might say, if we can stick to the agreed upon time, it means we can actually enjoy our evening without feeling rushed or stressed.
Exactly. You're focusing on the positive. M is for stay mindful,
Mindful.
meaning stay calm, focus on what you need, and try not to get pulled into arguments or distractions.
Oh, that's hard, especially if someone's trying to guilt you.
It's so hard, but you got this. And finally, A is for appear confident, and N is for negotiate.
Okay, so even if you feel nervous, project that confidence.
Fake it till you make it. And negotiating just means being willing to find a solution that works for everyone involved, as long as it doesn't mean compromising your own needs.
Got it. So it's not about winning or losing. It's about finding a way to coexist peacefully while honoring everyone's needs. Speaking of honoring needs, what happens when someone just doesn't? Like you've set a boundary, you've communicated it clearly, but they keep disrespecting it.
That's when those consequences we talked about earlier come into play.
Right, because boundaries without consequences are just suggestions.
Exactly. Think of it like this. You draw a line in the sand. Consequences are what happen when someone steps over that line.
Powerful imagery.
Yeah.
So it's not about punishing them, it's about staying true to yourself and how you want to be treated.
Exactly. And those consequences, they can be big or small, could be ending a conversation, could even be ending the relationship.
Wow, okay. That's a lot to unpack.
It is, but it's important to remember setting boundaries is not about punishing anyone. It's about protecting yourself, your mental health, your emotional well-being, all of it. It's so true. Are there any, specific tips for setting boundaries in different types of relationships? Because I'm guessing it's not one size fits all.
You're so right. It does look different depending on if it's a partner, a family member, a friend, a colleague. Let's start with romantic relationships.
Oh, yeah. Those can be tough.
They really can. You have such high hopes for the relationship, and it's easy to fall into that pattern of putting their needs before yours.
Totally. You just want everything to be harmonious.
Right. But one of the things that really stood out to me from the research is how important it is to maintain your sense of self even in a romantic relationship.
So even though you're building a life with someone, you're still your own person with your own needs and boundaries.
Exactly. Which means feeling comfortable saying, you know what, I need some time to myself. Or saying no sometimes.
So, for example, if your partner wants to do everything together, but you really need some alone time to recharge, that's something you can set a boundary around.
100%. It's all about finding a balance that works for both of you. Makes sense. What about family? Those relationships can be tough.
Oh, tell me about it. Family stuff is the trickiest. There's so much history, so many expectations, and sometimes, let's be real, a whole lot of guilt.
It's true. And there's that saying, you can pick your friends, but you can't pick your family.
Right. But even if you can't choose your family, you can choose how you interact with them and what you're willing to put up with.
Yes. Sometimes you have to lay down the law a little bit, even if it causes some waves.
It's true. So, like, if you have a family member who's always criticizing your life choices, you might have to say, hey, I understand you have a different opinion, but I'm not open to discussing this anymore. I need you to respect my decisions.
And if they can't, you might have to limit your contact with them or set some really firm guidelines for how you'll interact, which is hard.
Oh, it's so hard, especially with family. But you deserve to protect your peace of mind.
You really do. Okay, how about friendships?
Friendships are tricky because you don't want to seem like you're not supportive.
Right. Or that you're being too demanding.
But here's the thing. That same idea of clear communication, it applies to friendships too.
So, for example, if a friend is constantly leaning on you for emotional support, but you're feeling totally drained, it's okay to set a boundary around how much you can give.
Yes. It could be as simple as saying, listen, I care about you so much and I want to be there for you, but I'm feeling a little overwhelmed right now. I might not be able to respond to your texts right away, but I promise I'll get back to you as soon as I can.
That's great. You're setting a boundary while still letting them know that you're there for them.
Exactly. Okay, now let's talk about the big one, work.
Work. The land of blurred boundaries.
Tell me about it. So many people feel this pressure to be on all the time, like they always have to say yes to everything.
It's true. It's like we're afraid to say no to the boss, or we're worried about jeopardizing our careers.
I know. But burnout is real, and if you're feeling overworked and taken advantage of, something has to change.
So what can someone do in that situation? Where do you even start?
Well, the first thing is to figure out what your non-negotiables are.
Non-negotiables. What does that mean?
Think of it like this. What are the things you absolutely will not compromise on, even for your job?
So that could be making time for family, or getting enough sleep, or prioritizing your mental health.
Exactly. Those are your non-negotiables. And once you know what they are, you can start drawing some firm boundaries around them.
So maybe that means not checking work emails after a certain time, or setting limits on how much overtime you're willing to do.
You got it. And that might mean having some tough conversations with your boss or your colleagues.
Oh, I bet.
But here's the thing. When you come at those conversations from a place of respect, and you're clear about how setting those boundaries will actually benefit everyone, you might be surprised by how understanding people can be.
Right, because if you're rested and you have good boundaries, you're going to be more productive anyway.
Exactly. You're not trying to get out of work. You're trying to do your best work. And sometimes that means getting creative. Maybe you need to delegate tasks or figure out a more flexible work schedule.
Those are all great ideas. So we've covered a lot here. Romantic relationships, family, friends, even work. It seems like there are so many places where setting boundaries is important.
It really does touch everything, doesn't it?
It does. It's like this thread that runs through all of our interactions.
I love a thread because it's not about building fortresses around ourselves. It's about those little adjustments we can make to feel more at peace.
Absolutely. Speaking of adjustments, one thing that keeps coming up for me is what happens when you do set a boundary and someone just ignores it?
Ooh, that's the real test, isn't it? Anybody can say they have boundaries, but it's of holding them, even when it's tough. That makes all the difference.
It's walking the walk, not just talking the talk.
Exactly. And that, my friend, is where those consequences come into play. Remember when we talked about Dear Man?
Of course. Describe, express, assert, reinforce.
And that our reinforce that ties right into consequences. If setting a boundary is like drawing a line, then consequences are what happen when someone decides to step over it.
Okay, I see what you're saying. It's about having those consequences in your back pocket, ready to go if needed.
Right. It's not about being mean or anything. It's about standing firm in what you've said.
So what are some examples of those consequences, especially when someone just isn't getting the hint, or they're choosing to ignore you on purpose?
Well, let's say you've got that coworker who interrupts you constantly. You've tried the polite reminders, the I statements, all of that, but they're still not getting it.
Ugh, the worst.
Right. So you might have to up the ante a little.
What do you mean?
Instead of a gentle, excuse me, I wasn't finished, it might have to be more like, I've asked you not to interrupt. If it happens again, I'm going to leave the meeting.
Whoa, okay, so you're really laying down the law there.
And the key is to follow through. If they interrupt again, you get up and leave.
Wow. It shows them you're serious.
It does. You're aligning your actions with your words, which, let's be honest, can be hard.
Oh, so hard. Especially if you're worried about what other people will think or you hate conflict. Any advice for our listeners who are struggling with that fear?
That fear is so real. Honestly, it's usually the biggest thing holding people back from setting boundaries in the first place.
Why do you think that is? What are we so afraid of?
I think it's a few things. We're afraid of conflict, obviously, afraid of being rejected or hurting someone's feelings, and sometimes I think we're even afraid of our own power.
Afraid of our own power. That's really interesting.
Right. Think about it. So many of us, especially women, are taught to be pleasers, to put everyone else's needs first.
It's true. We're supposed to be nice, accommodating, and not make a fuss.
Right. So when we start setting boundaries, advocating for our needs, it can feel really uncomfortable. It's like we're going against everything we've been taught.
It's like we've internalized this idea that our needs are less important than everyone else's.
Exactly. Setting a boundary can feel almost radical because you're taking your power back.
I like how you put that, reclaiming your power.
Yes. And that can be scary, especially if it's new for you. But here's the thing. The more you practice setting boundaries, the easier it gets.
So it's like building a muscle.
100%. And like any new skill, you're going to have setbacks. You'll slip back into old habits sometimes. But the key is to be patient with yourself. Keep practicing. And celebrate those small wins along the way.
Those are such wise words. It's a process, not a one-time thing.
Exactly. And always remember, setting boundaries is not selfish. It's about being self-full. It's about making sure your own cup is full so you can show up as your best self for everyone else.
I love that.
Yeah.
Self-full, not selfish. That's going on a t-shirt. And thinking about everything we've talked about, it really all comes back to self-respect, doesn't it?
It all starts there. When we respect ourselves, when we value our time and energy, when we truly believe that our needs are just as important as anyone else's.
Then setting those boundaries becomes a little bit easier.
Exactly. It's not about creating distance or shutting people out. It's about building those healthy, respectful relationships that make life so much more enjoyable.
I could agree more.
100%. It's about learning to say yes to ourselves so we can show up more fully for the people we care about.
I love that. So we've talked about the what and the why of boundaries and even how to start setting them. But what I'm really curious about now is the how. How do we actually make them stick, especially when it feels like we're swimming upstream?
It's definitely not always easy, but the good news is it gets easier with practice.
Like most things in life. So any tips for building those boundary-setting muscles?
Well, one of the most powerful things you can do is start small.
Okay, so like we talked about earlier, saying no to just one social event or setting a time limit for a coffee date.
Exactly. Don't try to overhaul your entire life overnight. Pick one area where you want to create some healthier boundaries and focus on that.
What about those times when someone's really pushing back, like they just don't want to hear it?
Oh, I've been there. It can be really tough, especially if you're dealing with someone who's used to getting their own way. But remember what we said about consequences. Those are your secret weapon.
Right. Boundaries without consequences are just dot suggestions.
Exactly. You have to be willing to follow through on what you said.
Can you give us an example?
Sure. Let's say you have a friend who has a habit of calling you late at night to vent about their problems.
Okay, I think we've all been there.
Right. And you've tried setting a boundary like, hey, I love you, but I need to be asleep by 10 p.m., so can we talk earlier in the day?
So far, so good.
But then they call you at 11 p.m. anyway, and you give in because you feel bad.
I feel so seen right now. I hate when I do that.
We've all been there. But in that moment, you have a choice to make. You can answer the phone and reinforce the idea that your boundary isn't really a boundary. Or you can choose not to answer the phone and show yourself and your friend that you're serious about protecting your time and energy.
Okay, so what happens when your friend calls you the next day and is upset that you didn't answer?
That's when you have a conversation about it. You say, hey, I care about you and I want to be there for you, but I also need to take care of myself. When you call me late at night, it disrupts my sleep and makes it hard for me to function the next day.
It's so true. Sleep is sacred. But it's hard to prioritize your needs when you're worried about disappointing someone.
I totally get it. It's a process, and it takes practice. But the more you stand up for your needs, the easier it gets.
It's like building that self-respect muscle we talked about.
Exactly. And when you start respecting yourself more, it's amazing how much more respect you start attracting from others.
It's true. People can sense that energy.
They can. And they can sense when you're not respecting your own boundaries. Which brings us back to that idea of self-awareness. It's so important to be in tune with how you're feeling, what you need, and where your limits are.
Because if you don't know your limits, how can you expect anyone else to?
Exactly. And it's okay for those limits to change over time. What works for you today might not work for you a year from now, and that's totally fine.
So it's an ongoing conversation we have with ourselves and with the people in our lives.
Absolutely. And like any good conversation, it requires honesty, compassion, and a willingness to listen, both to yourself and to the other person.
I love that. This has been such an eye-opening conversation. Thank you so much for sharing your wisdom with us.
It's been my pleasure. Remember, setting boundaries is a journey, not a destination. There will be bumps in the road, but the most important thing is to keep moving forward, one step at a time.
So well said. And on that note, we'll leave you with this thought. What's one small boundary you can set today to start prioritizing your own well-being? It doesn't have to be anything major, just a tiny step in the right direction.
You deserve it.
Until next time.